And we are back on this 0 hour. I am Richard RJ Eskow, and anyone who's a regular listener to this program knows that I am constantly on about the so-called sharing economy and its inherent flaws. Our next guest did more than just rant about it. He wrote a book about it, and we're delighted that he's done so, and delighted to talk to him about it. Stephen Hill is a senior fellow at the New America Foundation, and he is the author of the book Raw Deal: How the Uber Economy and Runaway Capitalism Are Screwing American Workers. Stephen, welcome to the program.
Thank you. Nice to be here, RJ.
Oh, great to have you. And listen, I wanted to start with this before we get into the heart of the book itself. You wrote a piece recently on how big is the gig economy, and I want to talk about how many people are influenced by this the Uberization of the workforce, people working on demand, and so on. But first, I don't want to throw a curveball at you, but I do want to unload a pet peeve. I don't know about you. I'm not fond of the term gig economy, which seems to be gaining some credence because a gig is just a job. What do we mean by the gig economy?
Well, the gig economy is sort of synonymous with what's also called the on-demand economy, which is synonymous with the sharing economy. You know, these terms are sort of being used interchangeably, and basically they're referring to a host of companies that have web and app-based platforms that you can procure goods and services through. So companies like Uber, where you can get a driver with your app, Lyft, another ride-sharing company, TaskRabbit, where you can hire one of their rabbits to come and clean your house or rake your leaves, or increasingly a lot of employees are using TaskRabbit almost just like a temp agency to hire a bunch of people on a temporary basis. Airbnb, of course, for rental, short-term rentals. These are companies that are known as gig economy companies because people are getting just these short-term gigs, and there's even the term now micro gigs and nano gigs, which we can go into if you want to, because some of it is really somewhat alarming stuff, and so this is what people are referring to.
And I think we should. I mean, I certainly, we should talk about those things. I think that, of course, sharing economy, I've written myself that I think that's a misnomer, if not a hoax. I mean, if I'm driving to 14th and Main and I want to give you a ride, that's one thing. If you hire me to drive you to 14th and Main, that's not sharing, that's hiring. And so, and I know that's a essential issue that you address in your book. And TaskRabbit, first of all, I find the name offensive. That may be me personally, but human beings are not rabbits. And the idea that we'll just...
Yeah, it kind of conjures up that scene in Michael Moore's film about, about General Motors when one of the people was killing little pet bunny rabbits in order for food because they didn't have jobs.
Pets or meat. Right. That was her sign. Pets or meat.
That's right.
Which is pretty much the attitude in my mind that this trend has towards the American worker. Pets or meat. So Stephen Hill, how I think that I prefer on-demand economy if you're going to use anything. I mean, I know gig economy it seems to be catching on. Let's start with this. You were suggesting that while no one knows the true size of this on-demand economy, chances are, I don't want to speak for you, but chances are it's being underestimated. Is that a fair conclusion to draw?
Yeah, I think so. I think that the ways that we have used to count the labor force are not working as well as they used to. And I mean, the simplest example of that is look at the unemployment rate compared to the employment rate. It used to be the common sense among economic experts was that when the unemployment rate goes down, then the employment rate goes up, because as more people get jobs, then the unemployment rate goes down, employment rate goes up. They were kind of a seesaw. One goes up as the other goes down. But we've been living in a time where the employment rate is going down at the same time as the unemployment rate. How can that be? Well, it's because millions of workers have dropped out of the labor force, gone into the gray economy, and just making ends meet however they can without being in the labor force, and as a result, they are not statistically counted in the unemployment rate. And this is just one example of many where we really it appears that we're not counting things accurately as we used to. So then you also look at the count for the on-demand economy. They use labor surveys, household surveys, and other techniques to come up with a statistic estimate of how many people have full-time jobs, how many people are working part-time, these sorts of things. Well, it turns out that the number of 1099 forms, which are the forms that independent contractors and freelancers fill out for the IRS rather than a W-2 form, that those number of those forms are actually increasing by around 20%. And yet that's not what's usually used to figure out how many people are working in these different labor spaces. So, and then also the number of people filing a Schedule C for the IRS, which is a self-employment income form, that also has increased quite dramatically. And yet somehow we don't really systematically count these things and factor these in when we count the number of workers in different job classifications. So it's really it's a failure of our statistical gathering and our statistical analysis system that we're not accurately counting this stuff. And they quit trying to really accurately count it back in 2005. So we're way overdue to start doing this again in an expanded way.
It's a failure and arguably an injustice, right? Because we're not measuring these workers, and therefore we're not including their experience in our, policy decision making and our public debate and so on. Isn't that a fair statement?
Yeah, it is. I mean, basically, many of these workers are invisible from a statistical standpoint, and that just means, I mean, in a modern economy, you have to be able to count things.
Right.
And if you can't count things, it's like a plane flying without radar, without GPS. And that's really where we find ourselves in the economy today.
We're talking with Stephen Hill, author of Raw Deal: How the Uber Economy and Runaway Capitalism Are Screwing American Workers. Now, before we get on to the book, one last question. Is it possible, one of the things that economists puzzle over and worry over now is that the workforce participation rate for people in prime working years is unusually low right now. Are some of those people some of the invisibles we're talking about?
Yes, that's right. They're called discouraged workers. And even the head of the Federal Reserve, Janet Yellen, whose job is to mostly sound as positive about the economy as she possibly can, given the statistical numbers in front of her. Even she has said that we are not accurately counting the number of discouraged workers, and that the unemployment rate, as low as it appears, is really not giving us an accurate estimate of what's going on out there in the labor force. And when the head of the Federal Reserve is saying that, wow, that things are just not being counted accurately.
Let me pivot a little bit, Stephen Hill, and let's just go at this from a slightly different angle. A lot of people, especially people who are sympathetic to the worldview behind the corporations that are creating these jobs and so on, the Ubers of the world, we hear a lot in the debate that we just haven't modernized, and in some ways I think it's true, we haven't modernized our policy making in order to incorporate a new innovation. They'll call it the sharing economy, and we need to update our thinking in order to incorporate the sharing economy. But on one level, it seems to me that this on-demand economy is as old as the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory, where they were being paid piecework for the work they do. It's as old as street vendors or pedicab operators or anyone else who is being paid when they were hired to do a job and not being paid when they weren't. I mean, am I missing something here? It's in some ways, it seems, for all the technological trappings, that this is a step back to the 19th century.
Yeah, I agree with that assessment. It is going back in many ways to piecework. You have numerous workers today who not only have multiple employers, but they have multiple employers in a single day. People using apps to find work and running from task to task. And in many ways, this is how people worked in the 19th century, where people didn't have what we think of today as regular employment. They picked up work here and there, doing a little bit of this, a little bit of that, and because of that kind of existence is why the New Deal happened.
Right.
And so in some ways we are almost going back to a pre New Deal era in the going forward here, except it's being done in a very high tech sort of way, which has a lot of alarming qualities about it. And one of the interesting things that I find is that there's actually a fair amount of people celebrating this. Even people who consider themselves progressive and on the left, they're saying,
Right.
oh, in the morning you can drive a shift for Uber. In the afternoon, you can have your own takeout business. In the evening, you can write your article for a newspaper or a newsletter. And they're sort of portraying this sort of existence as if this type of flexibility to be able to do what you want is a great thing. And of course, having flexibility in your work, there's no question there's something nice about that. But it's also nice to have a steady paycheck.
And benefits and vacation and know where you're going to be in the morning and those types of things.
Those types of things. And because people don't realize that the amount of work that a lot of these workers spend finding the next
Right.
gig, finding the next job, that's unpaid time. Time at a job where, standing around the water cooler and talking to your fellow employees, that used to be paid. Going to a meeting so that you can coordinate things with your employees, that was paid work. That's not paid anymore in this gig economy. You're only paid for the exact amount of time you are actually performing that deed. I mean, I sometimes say it's as if Tom Brady only got paid for when he threw a touchdown as a quarterback, or a member of Congress only got paid when they actually passed legislation. And with this Congress, we use that rule. Of course, none of them would get paid hardly anything.
Or if Tom Brady were paid for the pounds per square inch of air pressure on his footballs, or
so the point is that you're only being paid for that exact moment that you're actually on that task doing it, and then once you're finished, boom, you are off and you are done, and then you got to go find the next job. So I just don't see how this can be terribly viable for too many workers. For those who are using it to, as part-time to supplement a little bit of income, sure, it has some potential in that regard. But the idea that somehow this could be the direction of our economy just doesn't hold up to scrutiny in any way that I can see.
Stephen Hill is the author of Raw Deal, How the Uber Economy and Runaway Capitalism Are Screwing American Workers. I just like saying that, by the way, screwing American, because I do feel they are. Another example, by the way, my great-uncle was a taxi driver in New York City. And while they did not live well, he did manage. And I look, when you bring up taxi drivers, everyone says, well, it takes so long and they're not clean and so on, as if the only alternative somehow were this fragmented piecework or the status quo. But he was somehow able to raise a couple kids driving a cab. And I guess where I'm going with this is, isn't there also a kind of downward spiral that takes place, which is more and more people lose regular employment and enter the gig or on-demand economy, the less they're going to get for their piecework, the less this piecework is going to be available, and pretty soon you're going to have a sort of dystopian vision of a majority of Americans struggling and unable to get by in the gig economy.
Yeah, there's a lot of truth in what you're saying. In terms of Uber, the thing that people have to realize, and your great uncle, if he was here, he could tell us this if he drove in New York City. If you look back at the history of livery for the last 200 years, and because people used to give people rides with their horse-drawn carriages. I mean, you can see Charles I in London in the 1600s, passed a law saying we've got to regulate all these people hiring themselves out because there's just too many of them. And you see this pattern where in economic downturns, people go to whatever vehicle they have, and they start offering rides for money. And then you see this proliferation of drivers, and this happened during the Great Depression in New York City and other places, and it led to a point where the New York Times and others were saying, hey, we've got to regulate this. It's crazy. There's too much chaos. There's too much congestion. And that's what led to the medallion system that now is much reviled. And the problem with the medallion system is it did not keep up with the times. And so truly in many cities, taxi service was pretty horrible, even though, as you say, I've heard this story many times, that it was a good living for many, many drivers. But nevertheless, for many people who couldn't get a taxi, it was just terrible service. And so, but that's because they so restricted the supply of cars that there wasn't enough cars to give good service. So along comes a player like Uber,
and I think
who suddenly says, we're not going to follow this rule at all. We're going to flood the street with cars, and lo and behold, suddenly the service is better. So this is not rocket science. It's real supply and demand. And if they simply had just lifted the number of taxis on the road, you know, going back 10 or 15 years, there would never have been a market space for Uber to intrude into the way they have.
And my point, which I think you're reiterating, Stephen Hill, is or helping make, is that it's not an either-or between an improperly run medallion system, which choked off the supply of taxi cabs, or Uber, which is going to flood the street with cars and eventually put a lot of middle-class working people out of work. I mean, isn't that, to a certain extent, one of the points of your book, that the way that American workers are getting screwed is because I look at Uber, for example, and what I see, and what I see at a lot of companies like Uber, is a conscious strategy of taking over a market, monopolizing it, and then jacking up prices, reducing the leverage of the worker to get a decent wage, getting people addicted to a low-cost service without people understanding that they themselves, as part of the broader economy, will suffer in the long run.
Yes, Uber has, when they first started, they took about 5% of every fare that a driver made. Now they're taking 25 to 30%. In some cities, they're up to 30% of taking each fare, and they continually cut their price at the same time. So the drivers are being squeezed from both sides of the pricing mechanism. And so there's many tales at this point of drivers who started out driving for Uber part-time, most of them. I mean, Uber's own numbers show that most drivers, 80% are part-time, over half drive 15 hours or fewer per week, and most of them last only a year because of the fact that Uber keeps cutting the pay. There was a study done using Uber's numbers, which I say you can trust Uber's numbers about as much as you can trust China or Greece's numbers. But nevertheless, there was a study done with a stamp of approval done by Princeton University economist
Alan Kruger,
using Uber's numbers, and it found that Uber's wages, according to them, were about $17 to $20 an hour, which was a lot lower than at one point Travis Kalanick was saying Uber's drivers were making $100,000 a year, and publications like the Washington Post and others were just publishing this without even checking into doing any fact checking to see if it's actually true.
And Stephen,
now we know that that's not true. And even with those numbers of $17 to $20, that doesn't account for the significant expenses that drivers incur in driving their cars for a living: gas, insurance, the car itself. All sorts of costs are being incurred. But here's the other thing about that report. So that report came out in January of this year. It had been the report had been predicated on data that was collected in November. And at the very time that report was coming out, Uber once again cut the amount that it gave to its drivers. So the report itself wasn't even founded on accurate data at that point, and yet Alan Kruger, unfortunately, put his imprimatur on that report, even though it was using bogus numbers. So this is the type of shenanigans that Uber does over and over again with its drivers as it tries to gain more and more market share.
Well, and I think the moral of the story is that trust these guys at your own risk, and the middle class is being even further hammered by the rise of this gig economy. And Stephen Hill, thanks for writing about this. Thanks for looking into it. And thanks for coming on our program. Stephen Hill is the author of Raw Deal: How the Uber Economy and Runaway Capitalism Are Screwing American Workers. Thanks, Stephen.
Thank you. My pleasure. There's a website for the book, just www.rawdealbook.com. Thanks so much.
Great.
Pleasure to join you today.
You bet.